30 pitchers in 30 minutes. It's perhaps the most difficult challenge I've ever faced, given that I could do a video 10 minutes plus on each of these top 30 pitchers in baseball. But the goal of this video is to give you something interesting, advanced, unique, something that you can take back to your friends and show them that you're smarter than they are on these pitchers. And I will execute that in this video. Bottom right, I will be down here talking. Bottom left, I'll have grips or pictures or heat maps or anything like a plot I'm talking about. And up top, I'm using Fangraphs ATC projections to give you their projected performance for the coming season. Let's do this. Paul Skenes is number one. Absolutely no surprise. This guy does a lot of things that are distinct. First off, he moves on the rubber based on the handedness of hitter that he's facing. This is about a 7-inch adjustment. He's more third base side when he faces left-handed hitters. And then he moves over to the first base side when he faces right-handed hitters. He's one of the only pitchers in baseball to do this. Aaron Savali makes another subtle adjustment like it. He also pitches backwards a lot. You hear this a ton on broadcast, right? Start a guy with breaking balls, then he goes to a fastball. But he has the fourth biggest increase in four-seam fastball usage as he progresses to two-strike counts. And he also has a really low arm angle. And for a while, all we had on the public side was release height. And Skenes' release height is average, quote-unquote average. But if you watch him, you know what he's doing to get to that release is not average. And now that we have arm angle, it allows us to see that he's so tall that despite him being almost a full sidearm pitcher, he's able to get up to an average release height, which creates really weird angles in what he does. And on top of that, he's adding a cutter and a runner two-seam fastball. So he's going to throw 7 pitches now for some reason. This guy's unbelievable. Tarik Skubal is number 2, the reigning Cy Young Award winner. I'm not going to talk about what you think I'm going to talk about here. Maybe you think I'm going to talk about the velocity. He added 3 ticks on his four-seam fastball since 2023. That is insane. I'm going to talk about his sinker, though. I love this pitch because there's not a lot of left-handed pitchers that have the confidence to throw inside to right-handed hitters, especially with a two-seam fastball that's going to run and have its natural miss be back over the plate. But he's really become effective with his pitch and setting up things on the outer third of the plate, his changeup, his slider. This pitch in 2022 was thrown about 20% of the time to righties. Wasn't good. He backed off it in 23, then brought it back up and shifted the location to this up-in part of the zone I'm talking about. And I just really like it. It performed really well, and I think, again, it set up things on the outer third of the plate. You want a development item with him quick here. Slider location is more away to righties, similar to where his changeup is. You look at a guy like Garrett Crochet. Crochet took a cutter and started moving it down into right-handed hitters. It did wonders for him. I wonder whether we see an iteration of Skubal where he maybe tweaks the slider a little harder and throws it down into righties and then really unlocks kind of pitching to multiple quadrants in the zone. But I love this guy. Zack Wheeler is next, and a common theme you'll see among the pitchers on this list is that a lot of these guys are really consistent, but what I think is overlooked is that oftentimes to be consistent, you have to make adjustments. Wheeler is a great example of that. 2021, he jacked up his cutter usage, started throwing that thing a ton. 2023, he added a sweeper. 2024, he added a splitter. Last year, he started throwing a ton of sinker to right-handed hitters as opposed to that four-seam fastball, and it worked really well. I gotta admit, though, this guy's kind of maxed out on pitches, right? And his four-seam fastball usage has dipped over the last couple seasons, alongside the fact that his velocity has also dipped. So if you look at Zack Wheeler and wonder what he's going to become, I wonder whether this is the year where that four-seam fastball ticks below 40% in usage overall, and he starts throwing a bunch of cutter and a bunch of sinker. He's now great versus left-handed hitters. That's always the problem here with a lot of these guys, especially more supinator types that can actually spin the ball really well. K- walk versus righties is 27%. It's 17% versus left-handed hitters. I wonder if this is the year again, less four-seam, more of everything else to lefties in particular. And I wouldn't be surprised if he puts up another amazing season. Number 4 is Logan Webb. Now, this guy had a weird year last year, which seems odd because he's done basically the same thing for 4 consecutive seasons. But in 2022 and 3, he was heavy changeup usage. Threw it to righties, threw it to lefties, didn't really matter. It worked really well. Bunch of drop, low slot guy. It was a really tough pitch to lift. Last year, he pulled down the usage of that offering, which was odd because that became his staple, so why back off the pitch? Instead, what he did was added a bunch of sweepers, started throwing it to righties, even threw it to lefties a little, which is particularly odd. It kind of worked. The results were good, but I thought it was fascinating that the guy who's lived on a good changeup was not throwing his changeup. I saw a quote where he said that he thought his changeup was weird all season, which is wild to me because he was so good with that pitch for basically 2 to 3 years. The thing that's interesting, though, you could see that he didn't like the changeup because he added a cutter in September. He's using this pitch about 18% of the time to left-handed hitters, which is a lot. And he's using it up in the zone despite the fact that the pitch actually has more drop than your average cutter, which is a weird combination. So maybe it worked in that small sample, but looking ahead to 2025, I'm fascinated to see if the league knows that the cutter's there and starts to barrel it, and then if he has another counter move, or whether the changeup is back. So there's a couple things to watch with Webb going into 2025. Number 5 is Garrett Crochet, one of my favorite pitchers in baseball. I think there's a universe where if you make me make a personal ranking, I would put Crochet 1 above Skenes, but it's really hard to put Skenes anything that is not 1. So I'd have him 1A, 1B with Skenes, I would say. Crochet last year, sweeper to start. Really good pitch, grades out amazing. Just didn't really work oppo-handedness. So to righties, it wasn't that successful. And I remember him getting clipped by Alec Boehm and talking post-game about how it wasn't working. So what he decided to do was add a bunch of cutter in and throw it down in as opposed to the sweeper down in, harder pitch down in. This thing 8 hitters up for the middle of the summer. Unbelievable pitch. Used it like 30% of the time to righties. And the sweeper kind of faded off. And what he did instead at the end of the year was brought back the sweeper a little bit, but then brought back a sinker to use versus left-handed hitters and right-handed hitters. You think of him in the context of Boston, okay? They had the lowest four-seam usage probably in the history of the sport. Crochet's four-seam grades out worse than his sinker, cutter, and sweeper. So what does Boston do in 2025 with him? No fastball, minimal four-seam fastball, mix in everything else a ton. I think there's a chance this guy puts up like a sub 2.7, 2.6 ERA. I'm hyped for him in 2025. Number 6 is Cole Ragans, who had a velocity downtick last year. He sat 96 to start the year, held that into late June, and then finished the year around 94.5, 95 miles per hour or so. You know, I remember in August, this guy had a 4+ FIP alongside this velocity dip, and I went, okay, that's it. Like, been a fun half of the year. He's not going to be able to hold it being stretched out this much with this massive innings jump. He talked about his lower half mechanics. Perhaps that's tied to the fact that the innings jumped a lot. He goes out in September, October and posts a 3 FIP. Basically pitched as good as he was early in the year with a fastball that was down a tick and a half. I think that encapsulates how good of a pitcher he is from a command standpoint, sequencing standpoint, maybe a visual standpoint of how he looks as a lefty to hitters. I just think that's exceptional. We're going to talk about pitchers later on this list who have dropped velo year over year and done a bunch of other things where they just completely stopped throwing four seam, etc. Ragans almost seems to be impenetrable to that. Really impressive season from him. Perhaps some subtle concerns that the velocity maybe dips again and guys figure him out. But for now, I'm still pretty confident in him going into 2025. Chris Sale is number 7. And in an effort to keep this around 30 minutes or so, if I can, I'm only going to do like 25 seconds on him. The big thing here is that we do not have stride direction data in the public sphere. I imagine teams have it internally. I think this would explain perhaps some of the deception and longevity that Sale has had. He's a crossfire guy. His release is further towards third base than 91% of major league left-handed pitchers. That's really all you need to know. He's an angles guy, and it works, and I really wish we had stride direction data on the public side. Before we get to Framber Valdez, I want to talk about my Substack. I'll link to it in the video description. During the season, I basically post anywhere from 5 to 7 times a week. And what I do is I look back at the prior nights or days starting pitchers and look at what they changed. And it allows me to kind of do a good job of keeping up with the league, but it also provides a lot of value, I think, to readers. I have 20 people in there now from front offices in major league organizations, a bunch of agency people in there. It's super cool. I love it. It's a lot of fun to do. And I've gotten really good feedback on it. There's 2 tiers, a totally free tier and a paid tier, $5 a month, $30 a year. In that paid tier, you get my pitching prospect rank, which has Stuff Plus numbers for every guy, even if they're not a AAA, which is not public info. But I think it's really valuable. I deep dive there. I'm also thinking about maybe paywalling the majority of my actual notes this season. So maybe you should just pay and then we'll see what goes from there. But I encourage you to sub, even if it's just free, you don't have the money, can't afford it. I think it still has some value and I think you'll enjoy the content. Number 8 is Framber Valdez. Now, we just talked about Sale being really far towards the first base side in terms of his release. Valdez is the opposite. He has a 96th percentile release towards the third base side of the rubber for a left-handed pitcher. So he's a very vertical guy and stands very over towards the third base side. So you can imagine facing Valdez versus Sale, the balls are coming out of almost completely different points. The big thing with Valdez is that his arm angle dipped a ton last year. So he's a vertical guy, but it dipped and everything started to drop more for him. The big advantage he has is that he's able to create more drop on his sinker at good velocity than other guys are from his slot. It's very similar to like Bryce Elder and Clay Holmes in terms of being high release, high slot, and being able to kill vertical break, create this really steep approach into the zone. It works for Valdez. The thing with him though, he's never really had a great slider. It's a good pitch. Like the shape doesn't look that bad. He gets drop on it. It's around 85 miles per hour. He just doesn't command it that well. A lot of it in the zone. That's probably the unlock for him as he ages. I know he's a big ground ball guy, but whether he can push that slider to a territory that we haven't seen and become a better pitcher. Number 9 is George Kirby, who's one of my favorite pitchers to watch on a daily basis. I always put him on. The thing here that's interesting, he's got a good fastball. He's also got good command. But modern pitching is having those two things and then cutting your fastball usage. He's gone from 45% in 22 to 39% in 23 to 34% last year. So the question is, what does he do this year? I bet it's going to go below 30%. I'll tell you why. Because last year he broke out a cutter when his slider wasn't performing that well. It almost seemed to me like he was using that cutter as a way to cue getting kind of depth and break back on his slider. Because the second he turfed that cutter, he went back to his slider. It looked better from a shape perspective, more sweep, a little bit harder, and it succeeded through the end of the year. And now we come and find out in offseason reporting that he's adding this cutter into his mix. And from my perspective, the only reason to add that cutter in there is to not throw your four-seam fastball. So we're running into a situation where this guy's got great command, bunch of pitches, and now he's backing off one of the pitches that is good because he realizes, like so many other people in the league, that four-seamers give up a lot of damage. And I love Kirby, command guy, deep mix, really fun. The question I'll ask you, and I'm not even going to answer it because I'm already at my minute here, does he actually want to generate swing and miss? I don't think he does. And I'm going to leave it at that. Dylan Cease at number 10, a guy we may see in a different uniform at the end of the year. Last season, he cut his curveball usage basically in half and really started using his slider a lot. This thing's really good because it's basically a pure bullet ball, and he throws it really hard. And a lot of the time, these don't grade out exceptionally well, but they perform really well because they're pretty platoon neutral in their shape. You think of like a sweeper is not a great pitch to throw opposite-handedness. Gyro balls like this that are really hard and hard enough work versus either-handedness, and I like them a lot. But we did see some subtle lefty concerns for him, where he wasn't doing great versus left-handed hitters. So he started to break out this crazy changeup thing, which we saw was like super slow. He slowed down his entire body. I have no idea what he was thinking on that. I'd love to see him actually legitimately try to throw like a split or some other kind of changeup. He also broke out a sweeper for righties. Why not? And then he started throwing a cutter. The cutter I thought had too much drop, and he was trying to jam it up in, which makes it a really command-dependent pitch. If he messes at all with that thing, I think it's going to get beat up. I do think we're going to see some evolution of him where he's not just this 3-pitch fastball, curveball, slider guy. We actually see something branch off, stick, and work for him. I'm just not entirely sure if it was any of the things we saw last year. I think he's probably got to work on a new cutter shape. And then I don't know on that changeup, man. Just give me a split. Number 11, Pablo Lopez. I wonder if this is the year things come full circle for him. And I'm saying that because when he got to Minnesota in 2023, he jumped in velo and he added a sweeper. And that was kind of the unlock for him. He became one of the better pitchers in baseball. Everyone thought he had untapped potential in Miami. But one of the things that he did in Miami was throw a cutter. And I think this cutter is maybe going to have to come back. I'm going to show you his plot, bottom left on your screen right now. This is a plot that in the modern age of baseball feels like someone would just put a pitch in the middle and bridge slider, bridge cutter, whatever it is, and just be like, you need something in the middle to get to other pitches. And especially when you notice the fact that he has some bit of a left-handed hitter problem, I think some kind of gyro ball cutter thing makes a lot of sense for him. Maybe he's hesitant to do it because it wasn't good when he was with Miami, but the difference now is the velocity. If he's got more velocity in the tank, which he does and he has shown and he's held, then I would imagine there's a variation of that cutter the Twins could come up with that would make him a really good pitcher. I'm kind of surprised he doesn't already have it or the Twins haven't already given it to him, but I think that's good. I like it. Number 12 is Sonny Gray, who I call the sweeper king because over the last 2 seasons, he has the highest run value in baseball on a sweeper by a pretty good margin, actually. He's like almost 50% greater than his next competition in terms of the run value on that pitch. His is distinct, though, because he gets a lot of depth on it. A lot of sweepers we're seeing now have some lift to it, and a lot of people think that's almost the key to the sweeper, right? It adds lift and sweep and flight. Gray's has depth. It almost looks more like a curveball, and he sits it at like 85 miles per hour, which is really hard to do. Some guys can barely even throw sweepers with a lift at 85, and Gray's doing that with a drop, which you want. Now, the thing is, lefty approach, a lot of these righties I'm going to talk about lefty approach with, you generally don't want sweepers opposite-handedness. I've theorized that as they attain drop, it's easier to use that pitch oppo-handedness. Right now, he uses that curveball a lot that he has, 2 lefties. I wonder if this is the year where that sweeper, because of the depth it has, even though it's slightly taboo, is the pitch he starts to lean on versus left-handed hitters. We see this similar idea with sinkers as well. If they have more drop, they become more platoon neutral. Really fun pitcher, high floor. Another guy that maybe we'll see on another team at the end of the year. Logan Gilbert, number 13, the big guy. He has the highest extension in baseball, minimum 1,000 pitches, which means he releases the ball the closest to home plate of basically any pitcher in baseball. He has 7.6 feet of extension. The average is somewhere around 6.5 feet. Almost a full 1.5 feet more. That's big, especially when we're talking about small reaction times in baseball. He's also a low spin guy. And I've heard before, how do you succeed as a low spin guy? I think he's kind of the answer. It's not a great answer. It's that you need weird body traits or massive extension or anything along those lines to succeed with low spin, because I think we've just become so tolerant and needy of these righties with big sweep to kill other righties. Gilbert needed to do a lot of other things. And you can also see that because he's not great spin, the four seam isn't good. So like Kirby, he went 54% four seam down to 42% in 23, down to 31% last year. He added a cutter and a sweeper last year. The sweeper's tagged as a curveball. He changed his stride direction, his slot fouling ticked up in velo, which was really impressive. And now he's potentially adding a death ball and a splinker. I feel like he just looked up the buzziest pitches in baseball and was like, I want both those in my mix. The Mariners are an absolute factory. And Gilbert, I don't even know what to say. He's unbelievable. Number 14, Jacob deGrom. If you're watching this, I think I've said, and I'm realizing this as I'm taping, that I love basically every pitcher. So I feel like I have to stop saying that. But it's honestly hard to not say that about deGrom. But I think he's more of a teaching tool. He has above average extension, a below average release, above average vertical break, and he's sitting 98 miles per hour. If you're building a fastball in a lab, I think you give these traits to that fastball, right? It's a low slot, he carries the ball, and he throws really hard. That's a sick combination. It's one of the reasons why he's been so good. Maybe also one of the reasons why he hasn't thrown more than 90 innings in a season since 2019, but we're all hoping he can do that this year. The reason I think he's so good and been so good for so long is that fastball element, but I also think he's got what I call command at velocity. Command is dependent on velocity to some extent. Guys who throw harder usually aren't able to command the ball as well. That's what we've seen from baseline command research and stuff. So if his velo's down or he doesn't catch back up, I wonder if he starts to add in other things, which gets to another video of mine that I've done. This is the year of the mix. He's got a changeup, he's got a curveball. He rarely ever uses them because he just plays fastball slider games and reads hitters on the inner third of the plate. He's a magician. But maybe this is the year we get changeup and curve from deGrom. I guess we'll see. All right, Corbin Burnes, number 15, the guy that I could not escape everybody saying online that his K rate is dropping, the cutter isn't as good. Fix the cutter. I'm sure he knows. As to whether he can fix it, we'll see. We saw late last year, what he started to do was just cut the heck out of the pitch. But for the most part of the year, it did have more vert than it usually does, which I think to some extent made it slightly less effective in terms of how he normally locates it kind of down away off the plate to righties in particular and kind of inside to lefties. His cutter's good because the average cutter from a righty is 90 miles per hour, 8 inches of vertical break, induced vertical break, right? So that lift, and 3 inches of glove side movement. Burnes is 95 miles per hour, 12 inches of vertical break, and a comparable amount of glove side. So that's the trade-off, right? A lot of the times what we see is guys get behind the ball more, add more vert, but also add velocity. So the ability to kind of hold that supination and create drop and then add 5 miles per hour is a really good trade-off for him. That's why that pitch is so good. I'm fascinated to see what he does this coming season. He's got a sweeper too. This pitch he hates throwing apparently. He brought it in 2023, second half, got beat in the postseason on William Contreras with it. 2024, he broke it back out in August. This is the hack for him to unlock his K rate, is to throw more sweeper to right-handed hitters. As to whether he doesn't want to do that because he doesn't like the pitch or maybe it hurts him, I have no idea. That is the unlock if he wants more strikeouts. If not, it's going to go back to the finesse side and getting the cutter shape back. Number 16, the north sider, Justin Steele. A weird pitcher because he throws a four-seam fastball, but if you were to look at the average traits of a four-seam fastball and a cutter, Steele's four-seam fastball is more like the cutter, not like the four-seam fastball. But classification goes off what the pitcher wants it to be called. Or most of the time it makes sense, right? That's just how he naturally releases a fastball. That's what you end up with. It's weird though. And I've wondered whether these kind of cut fastball shapes visually hide sliders better off of them. We just talked about Corbin Burnes and his cutter, sweeper, kind of slider, weird combination off that. But I wonder whether it helps Steele from a slider perspective. The problem I see, not even really a problem, I think something going forward, sinker changeup. His sinker is pretty good. He broke out a little to left-handed hitters last year. I remember him throwing it to Matt Olson. And his changeup, he's actually able to create some arm side fade and drop with it. They're pretty nasty. And this is the evolution for him. You look back to Max Fried, who became a huge changeup guy to right-handed hitters, despite the fact his curveball and breaking ball is really good. Steele wants to take the next step, which I think he could have in him. To me, it's changeup refinement and throwing that sinker. You want to Skubal it. We talked about Skubal earlier. Throw that sinker inside to right-handed hitters. That would shock them. And it'd be very weird and probably uncomfortable. I don't know if Steele has the level of command to do it, but I'm fascinated to see if he could become more of a true four-pitch guy if he wants to take the next step. Yoshinobu Yamamoto is a good example of the Dodgers and the fact that they don't really love elevating fastballs a ton, especially when they're more average in shape, which I think Yamamoto's is rather than being exceptionally good. So they don't elevate. So what they do against right-handed hitters in particular is just throw them on the outer third of the plate. I made a video wondering whether this was to help tunnel everything off that pitch, sliders away. They like these short sliders as opposed to big sweepers in a lot of their starting pitchers. But you also see a template for what maybe they attempt to do with Sasaki here, where for April, they basically didn't add anything to Yamamoto. They just let him do whatever he wanted. And then you saw May, June come, and he started to go sinker. He started to go slider. Both those pitches graded out really well and ended up being pretty strong pitches for him as the season went on and down the stretch. Looking to 2025 for him, I think we just end up seeing more of these pitches. Versus righties, I think it's going to be more sinker, more slider, less four seam, less everything else. Versus lefties, I wonder whether they go less four seam there and add in some cutter, which he didn't use a ton. Wasn't a particularly great pitch, but I do think from an execution standpoint, is still pretty good for him. So we'll see what 2025 brings. I think, again, we're going the year of the mix. A lot of the theme on my channel here, and Yamamoto, I think, is going to expand out of it. Joe Ryan is a great example of a flat approach fastball. I generally think that term is overused now in the industry because we've become much more comfortable talking about approach angles and vertical break, etc. Flat approach is Joe Ryan. He's like the OG flat approach guy. He's got a 4.7 foot release height. The average is more than a foot higher than that at about 5.8 feet. 94 miles per hour, only 14 inches of vertical break. This is why when you look at a lot of models, release height and arm angle, which I talked about a bit in relation to Paul Skenes, are two of probably the strongest variables. Like if you really reduced it down, you were like, I want to know like two things about a pitcher's fastball, characteristically of what we have on the public side. Velo and release might be 1 and 2. I don't even know. I think you could probably assume shape or play around with shape or adjust shape, slot, etc. But that release point and that velocity are really predictive. Joe Ryan is the OG upshoot guy. He's a driveline baseball product as well in terms of working there and developing. He added a sinker last year, backed off his four seam. He jumped 2 ticks. Fun development. He got hurt at the end of the year. We'll see how that plays out in 25. But lefty approach maybe needs some refinement. 50% of this four seam he throws to lefties. I wouldn't say he's pigeonholed, but I don't know if there's too many routes for him to go apart from that. Maybe throw more slider. That's pretty risky. I don't really see a cutter in this mix because of that slider shape. But OG flat approach guy. Don't forget it. Every single year, Blake Snell seems like he just decides to pick a pitch to use a ton in his mix. Maybe that's part of what makes him so good. 21 and 22, really slider heavy. 23, decided to throw his changeup a quarter of the time. 24, he decided to throw his curveball 26% of the time. He's almost like a random number generator every year. And I just wonder whether you catch steam with him, as he's done a couple times and won some Cy Youngs because of how comfortable he is with multiple pitches. I'll also say, a lot of people say, not great command, look at his walk rate. The simple way to think about him is that he doesn't like throwing fastball in fastball counts. And as a byproduct of that, he's just willing to walk you. He's comfortable with guys on base. He's totally cool with just throwing all his off-speed junk. And I think he just sits around the shadow enough for it to work. He doesn't need fastball. He's not going to throw you a fastball when he's behind in the count because he knows that's going to allow a barrel. He'll just put you on base and he's going to strike out the next guy. That's what he's hunting. And I wonder whether we see more pitchers in baseball like him. It's just a weird combination because a lot of the time when you get command guys, they want to pound the zone, or we think of command guys as strike guys. Snell is not that. The slider here is the interesting thing, though. The Dodgers have been a factory in making good sliders. Snell's talked in the past about how this slider is pretty volatile. You see the shape of it move pretty occasionally, too. It's kind of more of a cutter. He doesn't create a lot of drop with it. I wonder if the Dodgers can solve his slider problems and whether that is the pitch that he leans on this year. Michael King is our next guy. You may have noticed I stopped saying numbers because I think as I'm recording this, I messed up the numbers. So we're just going to say names now, and then I'll eventually reorder them after the fact. But Michael King is a template pitcher, as I'm going to call it. I almost call it the Yankee template, let's say. I'm going to put up his plot bottom left here. Take a look at that. The big thing here is that this is a guy who in the past was like sinker slider, and it's like, whoa, look at those shapes you could create. Look at how much arm side and glove side you could create. That separation between the two pitches. These pitchers have now started to evolve with pitch design and everything we know about seam orientation to throw a bunch more pitches. This is why Clay Holmes has turned into the beast that he's turned into, as we've seen in spring. Hayden Wesneski's kind of like this. Will Warren on the Yankees, Cody Petit on the Cubs. All these guys, low slot supinators who could create shapes. And then it's like, oh, we can actually figure out a fastball orientation to get you some vertical. And oh, here's a changeup you could work with too. But he's an encapsulation of what seam effects pitch design has really become, where you take a guy who feels like he's in one lane and then you can make him a multi-lane pitcher and push him to like 170 innings. Really fun pitcher. Curious to see his lefty approach this year. K-minus walk is 10 percentage points lower versus lefties than it is righties. His changeup is his primary pitch to lefties. 4-seam didn't perform that well. Is his command good enough to use his sinker to lefties? We'll see. Cristopher Sanchez is next. He's odd because he's similar to what Framber Valdez is. High slot and creates a lot of drop. That makes the pitch really hard to lift because of the steep approach it has into the zone. He jumped 2 ticks last year. Started using his changeup a lot more. Almost became his primary pitch, which makes me wonder whether there's any pitcher that could actually survive as a starter throwing his changeup as his primary pitch. Very weird in that respect. He's short, big extension. The weird thing, though, everything he throws is down in the zone. Just look at his plots. He does not elevate. He does not move in, out. He's picking a middle, and he's throwing things, and they're all dropping, and it's really hard to lift him. I think for his evolution to really take off, and we saw this because the sinker wasn't great last year, he's probably got to move in, out, or elevate. Similar to like Ranger Suarez on that team, I wondered whether there's some synergy there between them and their approaches. He's adding something, as it's been quoted. I imagine that's probably some kind of cutter to work inside. If he could execute that thing and land it inside, I do think that would help the changeup away. But I wonder if he needs more separation in the zone as opposed to just being a down in zone guy, and whether that trick is kind of over with at this point. Max Fried is my next guy here. I don't have a ton to say about him, partially because I think I hit on the main point with him on Justin Steele, which is that he cuts his fastball. It's basically a cutter, but it's tagged as a four-seam fastball. But Fried, unlike Steele, has become a quantity pitcher as he's aged. His changeup is actually one of his main pitches to right-handed hitters. But he also exists in this weird space where, because he spins the ball well, he just decided to throw a bunch of breaking balls. So he started throwing a sweeper last year, which I didn't really think was too necessary. He didn't really need it opposite-handedness, because the cutter slider thing that he throws down in works pretty well. I think he also has a cutter and a slider and a curve. It's kind of a mess. Like, I'll throw his plot up bottom left here, take a look at it. It's just a bit confusing from a variety of directions, but he's a fun pitcher. Going to Yankee Stadium, he had subtle lefty problems last year because of that cut shape. So that maybe comes back to bite him, but I don't think that's too big of a concern because he's not going to face a lot of left-handed hitting. But yeah, I'm curious to see if the slider cutter from a results standpoint ever get to be more plus, and maybe he backs off the changeup. Don't have a ton to say on him. Good pitcher. I think that's a reasonable deal for the Yankees. We'll see how he does against lefties. Bibee's a great example of a young pitcher breaking into the league. Not a big book on him. Does really well in 2023. Then you get into 2024, and it's very apparent very early that his four seam is not going to work versus the left-handed hitters in terms of where he's locating it, trying to throw it. I think he was trying to throw it up in. So what he did, as any pitcher is doing this year, in the time of the year of the mix, as I made a video on, and I've already referenced a couple times in this particular video, he added a sinker and he added a cutter. So he was ahead of his time. Last year partially was maybe the year of the mix for some guys. And Bibee in particular, I like both these pitches, partially because the cutter is interesting. This gets into classification a bit. I think this is a slider. It's just a second slider. He kind of throws a sweeper and then he throws this shorter slider off it. That's good. I actually think the crazy thing here is that maybe there's room to add an actual true cutter onto him. There's this shape called a Yankee cutter, which has like lift and glove side movement, which some guys throw. It's becoming a bit more popular. We're seeing like a couple Dodger guys throw it, a couple Yankee guys throw it, etc. It's like the OG Mariano Rivera cutter, actually. Kenley Jansen, etc. Get glove side and vert and throw hard. Hard to do. I wonder if Bibee has that in the tank alongside the slider and the sweeper, because I don't think that's a cutter. But that's besides the point. For this coming year, this is probably who he's going to be, is a sinker cutter guy alongside some of the other stuff he does. He's got a fun changeup too that he's developed and worked on that I think actually is somewhat of an unlock for him relative to other guys who have similar profiles where everything is moving to the left side. Bibee's changeup's really important to his mix. We haven't talked a lot about plots in this video, somewhat intentionally. Glasnow I'm going to bring it up with because a lot of the time what you see is slot aligns with plot. That rhymes, and that is completely unintentional. But Glasnow's plot, bottom left right now, very vertical, right? He's a very vertically slotted guy. And the key with this, I think a lot of the time, is if you can't create left-right stuff, which he's actually started to do. He's thrown a sinker a bit last year, 9%, which is fun. Mixed in a changeup. I wonder if there's a split in his tank. Besides the point, though, you have to throw hard in order for these shapes to work, these vertical shapes to work. And Glasnow has this weird thing with his finger. I think his finger is actually like broken or something, which is partially the reason why he cuts his fastball like this. And maybe the reason why he's able to hold velo on a lot of his shapes. His slider is really good because he gets a lot of depth at velocity. We're talking about cutters, right? You add depth as you get behind the ball. The same concept applies to sliders most of the time. Glasnow has basically 0 inches of vertical break at 90 miles per hour. The average slider in baseball is 86 miles per hour, and it actually has more. So I would expect, if you're telling me this guy's throwing a 90 mile per hour slider, for it to go maybe up at 3 inches of vertical break or 4 inches of vertical break. But Glasnow has that ability to create drop despite the velocity and literally have more drop on his pitch than an 86 mile per hour cutter, 4 miles per hour harder. That is how you have a really good stuff plus pitch. Aaron Nola is a weird pitcher because he uses his curveball as his primary pitch, almost to either handedness of hitter, which is pretty wild. Really good command of this offering. I think that the key with him is that he's able to get drop and spin the ball really well from his slot. So he's really low slot. And I feel like a lot of the times these low slot guys only kind of create one plane. Maybe this is honestly a critique of a guy like Paul Skenes to some extent. It's like he struggles a little bit to create like vertical planes. He just has good enough command to move things around. Nola can actually create like a depth shape on this curveball at a reasonable velocity around 80 miles per hour for it to work, and he commands it well. The problem here is that over the last 2 years, he hasn't been great versus left-handed hitters. It's a theme on this video. A lot of the times, good righties are kind of more average versus lefties, and they destroy right-handed hitters. And the net is a lot of innings and a very good pitcher at the end of the day. But with Nola, it's interesting because he's a primary curveball guy. And if you look at his location of his curveball to left-handed hitters, it's like a backdoor pitch. I wonder whether he's a great example of needing tunnels to some extent. Tunneling, I think, is a generally overused term, but I don't think Nola has tunnels. He kind of steals strikes with a curveball, and then there's nothing else to lefties. Like, if it looks like a ball out of his hand and it's the curveball, it's probably a strike, and then everything else has its own tunnel. And it's weird for me to have a guy who isn't making his primary pitch something to tunnel off, if that makes any sense. Hope that makes sense. I don't really know if that actually makes any sense, but I'm going to try to throw some stuff up bottom left as I'm talking, or as I've just talked, to help. So I hope it made some bit of sense. Nola, the curveball guy. Schwellenbach is next. If you're asking me if there's a guy to fade on this top 30, as we get towards the end here, there might be a few because we're looking at younger guys, and the differences between them at 28 or 27 and 40 is probably not that large. Schwellenbach, though, is interesting to me because he came up and was really good last year. But the slight problem I see is that a lot of these other guys on the list, I've talked about how they've progressed, where they did one thing and then it was like, I need more pitches, so let me expand my mix, or I'm going to drop my fastball now. Think of all those Mariners pitchers. Schwellenbach came up with very limited four-seam fastball usage already and a deep mix. Like, he's got everything that you could possibly need for a pitcher. While that's good, I wonder whether there's like a hole in his game, especially to left-handed hitters, which again, you'll see for a lot of righties like him who create good breaking ball shapes. His K-minus WAR versus lefties is 11 percentage points worse than it is versus righties. For me, his adjustments going forward, if he runs into problems, are probably going to be based off location. And those adjustments, I think, are a little weirder to find. So I don't love fading Schwellenbach, but if there was a guy on this back half here that I'd fade and maybe say is not going to be in the top 30 next year, or not be higher, because a lot of these guys are probably going to have to jump up to sustain it, I'll say Schwellenbach. Not confident in it. I just wonder whether he's almost a little bit maxed out. Hunter Brown was really, really bad to start last season, and I look like an idiot because I made a breakout pick video on him, and it did not go well. But he ended up actually breaking out, so I'm glad that that has come full circle for me. And I didn't totally give up, I guess, on thinking that he was going to be good. I liked him because it looked like the Verlander-y template, good fastball, decent breaking ball, and his slider thing was really good, where he's throwing it super hard, he's getting some drop on it, which is a theme I've mentioned on this video of good slider and breaking ball shapes overall. The thing with him, though, he was weird because he was basically using two fastballs at the top of the zone. Like, he was going sinker up and four-seam up after he added that sinker. He also went back to like an older version of his slider as opposed to splitting it out. The hesitation is just that the sinker doesn't grade out that well. So I wonder whether you go into this season and righties kind of have a much better idea of what's going on with him and just start to clobber the top of the zone with him. We'll see. He can maybe move that sinker like down in and push the fastball up away and really start to pitch to sides of the plate as opposed to being like a pretty vertical pitcher. I could see that happening and see that working overall. But yeah, the righty approach isn't like amazing, partially because he's not like a big sweeper guy. And he's got that nasty split for lefties, etc. So he's fun. I could see some maybe minor regression. I still like him overall. He's probably my number 1B fade on this list if you were to make me fade somebody. Kevin Gausman, actually one of the best pitchers over the last 3 seasons from a WAR perspective, right next to a guy like Zack Wheeler. Insanely good pitcher. Last year, he had what I'd call strikeout death, where his strikeout rate went from 31% down to 21%. Not great. And he also ticked down in velo over the last couple of years. He's down basically a full tick since 2022. The thing that jumps out here is he's literally never had a good slider. 12 years, he has had one time with a positive run value on his slider. One time. And this guy's still the 3rd best pitcher in baseball over the last 4 seasons. It's honestly like insane to some extent to me. I wonder whether he reverts now because of the velo being down, that he can't use this much fastball. He's actually increased his fastball usage, and he's throwing like 70% behind in the count. I get you could survive with command, but the second that velo ticks down, I think you're going to run into massive problems. We heard this offseason, he's thinking about adding a cutter. I think that's super important, especially for behind in the count for him. This fastball usage has to come down this season for him to be good. I'm not doubting him because of just how sublime that weird split change thing he throws is. I think it's like Vulcan, right? Or is he here? Don't remember. I'll throw a picture up bottom left though to show you. Fun. Let's see what the cutter does. Got to stop throwing so much 4-seam behind in the count. Another velo drop guy. We're getting to the old guys here. Gerrit Cole. Lost 2 ticks in the last 2 seasons. He threw a bunch of cutters last year as a byproduct. So this was like Gausman maybe delayed his adjustment, partially because he maybe didn't need to adjust because he's so good with the 4-seam and the split and stuff that he throws. Cole knew he needed to adjust and then immediately adjusted. So I thought that was fascinating. Where the velo was down, he's like, I will not be a 4-2 pitcher. I'll be like a 4-8 pitcher if I keep throwing my 4-seam. So let me throw a bunch of cutter. I believe he told Saris, or Saris at some point had a quote from him that in the past he didn't really want to throw the cutter a lot because he thought it would bleed with the four-seam shape, which is definitely an idea around four-seam fastballs, but I wonder whether we're getting away from that with modern seam effects and pitch design understanding, etc. But yeah, the cutter grades better than the four-seam fastball. So the question for me is, okay, the velo's back for him, let's assume in 2025. What do? Do you go back to the four-seam, or are you comfortable enough to expect the cutter to still work and not bleed back into your fastball? That's probably the main thing to watch with Gerrit Cole. The last guy, we did it, 30 pitchers. We're talking velo drops here, 3 in a row. Luis Castillo's velo's fallen a bit. The thing with him, though, and he doesn't really have the same exceptional like four-seam shape as a guy like Gerrit Cole, but he's been good for so long because I think of the body traits here. He's a short guy. Only 5% of pitchers in Major League Baseball have a lower release or arm angle than him. So it's 95th percentile in terms of how low he is. He's just a low extension guy too. So maybe he's a case that extension matters, but on the extremes, I don't think it really matters a ton. He's giving guys more time to see his ball and they're still not hitting it. But if you're a left-handed hitter in the last 2 seasons, you have seen his ball really well and you have pounded it. Last year, he did not have a positive run value pitch versus left-handed hitters. He's done the same thing from an approach standpoint each of the last 2 years. I gotta imagine this is the year he starts to tinker a little bit with the lefty approach and figure something out. But apart from that, unique pitcher, really fun pitcher. I think he's somewhat resistant to regression because he works 2 fastballs that are both reasonable in grade, although I'd love to see the velo jump back up, and he's got a good slider changeup. There's enough there from a mixed standpoint for him, I think, to survive regression as he ages. I just gotta imagine there's something else he's thinking he's gonna do versus lefties this season. We did it. Long video. I usually don't do stuff like this, but I thought this was a really good exercise, primarily because I wanted to dig into these guys and come up with some topics. It really refined my own personal analysis, and I hope you enjoyed a lot of the things I brought up. And honestly, as I hit end record on this, I do not know if we got under, like, we're definitely over 30 minutes, but I'm wondering whether it's like a 35. But I really don't want this video to be like 44 minutes and me to call it 30 pitchers in 30 minutes, because it's gonna make no sense. So I'm gonna jump out of here. Thanks for watching as always. Subscribe to my Substack, and I really hope this is under 40 minutes in total length.